quiet town of Marshall, located a mile from the rural district, seems like a place taken from a dream. The Victorian-style houses, with their well-kept gardens and tree-lined paths, contrast with the unsettling history that lingers on its outskirts. Life in Marshall continues with an almost disturbingly calm pace. Children play in the streets, shopkeepers greet regular customers, and the local newspaper, The Advance, Marshall, reports the daily news. However, beneath this apparent normality, a latent fear is hidden. The shadow of the Manton house casts a deep fear in the community, a dark presence that everyone prefers to ignore. The old Manton house, known throughout the rural district and the town of Marshall for being haunted, has not been occupied by mortals for more than 10 years. Surrounded by brambles, thorns, and trees twisted by the wind, the house stood on a lonely path, devoid of any trace of human life. A decade ago, Mr. Manton, in a fit of madness, slit the throats of his wife and children before disappearing into the night. One afternoon, 3 men were sitting in the quiet corner of the hotel porch in the town of Marshall, smoking and discussing trivial matters. Their names were King, Sancha, and Rosser. A short distance away but within earshot, yet not participating in the conversation, sat a stranger. All they knew about him was that upon arrival, he registered at the hotel as Robert Grossmith. He hadn't spoken to anyone except the hotel clerk, and he seemed content to be alone. While this was happening, the men were saying, "I hate any kind of deformity in a woman," said King with disdain. "Whether natural or acquired, I have the theory that any physical defect has its corresponding mental and moral defect. I once abandoned a charming young woman upon discovering she had a secret beneath her perfect appearance. It was brutal, but I couldn't bear it. The young woman was a beauty, with long dark hair cascading over her shoulders and eyes that shone with a hypnotic intensity. Her skin was pale and smooth, almost like a delicate porcelain, and her beautiful smile had the power to truly light up any room. However, she confessed that she was missing the middle toe on her right foot. Unable to bear the idea of an imperfection, I left her without hesitation." Instead, Sancha interrupted. "By marrying another gentleman, she ended up with her face and throat cut," he said, with a light laugh, referring to the sinister event. "Shawl." The 3 men began to laugh about the incident, but when they turned around, they realized that Grossmith, he is listening to the conversation. "Look at that guy," said Rosser in a low voice, fixing a steady gaze on the stranger. "That guy, he is obviously listening to our conversation with interest." "Damn his imprudence," murmured King. "What should we do?" "That's easy," replied Rosser, standing up. He approached the stranger with a challenging tone and said, "Sir, I think it would be better if you took your chair to the other side of the sidewalk. The presence of gentlemen is clearly an unfamiliar situation for you." The man jumped up and advanced with clenched fists. His face was pale with rage. Everyone was now standing. Sanchez quickly stepped between the two, trying to calm the situation, saying, "You are hasty and unfair. This individual has indeed done nothing to deserve those words." But Rosser refused to retract. "In the South, At that time, such disputes could only be resolved in one way, with a duel. Duels were a common practice and a matter of honor. Although officially prohibited, they were tolerated and accepted as a means to resolve differences between gentlemen. Grossmith took a deep breath, trying to calm himself while attempting to keep his dignity intact. But finally, with a firm voice, he said, "I demand justice as befits a gentleman. I have no acquaintances in this region." He paused, looking for someone among those present. "Perhaps you, Mr. Sanchez, would be kind enough to represent me in this matter." Sanchez reluctantly agreed while King agreed to act for Rosser. The meeting was set for the following night. The nature of the agreement would be a knife duel in a dark room, a common practice in the Southwest. As agreed, on the following night, a carriage moved slowly along the dusty road leading to the Manton house. The air was heavy with humidity, and the relentless moon cast long shadows over the desolate landscape. The carriage stopped in front of the haunted house, creaking and groaning under the weight of its occupants. 3 of the men got out immediately, each showing signs of tension on their faces. Their gazes turned towards the house with a mix of curiosity and fear. The 4th man, however, remained in the carriage, reluctant to join his companions. His face was pale and sweaty. His hands trembled slightly as they clutched the reins. "Let's go," said one of the men. Addressing the 4th, "This is the place." The man looked at the house with disdain and suspicion and replied with a voice full of distrust, "For God's sake, this is a trap, and it seems to me that you are involved." "Perhaps I am," replied the other. "Remember that the choice of location was, certainly with your consent, left to the other party. Unless you're afraid of ghosts." "I'm not afraid of anything," he grunted, joining the other 3 men at the door of the house. The front door was covered in rust. The creaking of the hinges echoed in the air, sending a shiver down the men's spines. Finally, they managed to open it and enter the oppressive darkness inside. They lit a candle and entered a large square room, covered in dust and cobwebs. The light cast flickering shadows on the walls, adding a sinister air to the scene. "Gentlemen, is everything ready?" asked one of the men with a candle and some keys in his hands. "I believe everything is correct. Are you ready, Mr. Rosser?" The man who stood apart from the group bowed and smiled. "And you, Mr. Grossmith?" The large man bowed and frowned. "Would you do me the favor of removing your coats?" continued the man with the candles and keys. Their hats, coats, vests, and scarves were quickly removed and thrown through the door into the hallway. The 2 men were preparing for a duel to the death. Gripping the knives, they positioned themselves in opposite corners of the room. "Gentlemen, do not move until the door closes." Suddenly the light went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps and held breaths. The sound of stumbling was heard. In turn, how did the inner door close? And finally, the outer door closed with a bang that shook the entire house. Amidst the confusion, Grossmuth felt a chill run down his spine, as if something cold and unnatural had touched him. Everything fell into absolute silence. It was then that Grossmuth suddenly realized he had been left alone in the room. Suddenly, he felt a soft whisper, but laden with hatred, that seemed to come from everywhere. A voice resonated in the room, freezing Grossmuth's blood. From the shadows emerged eyes that watched him with an almost animal intensity. They were two children, their faces distorted by pain and anger, fixed on him. The gazes were accusatory, penetrating, and a faint, incomprehensible whisper escaped their lips, surrounding him in a sinister chorus. Another figure appeared from the shadows. A woman with an unmistakable face emerged like a spectral presence, her white dress tattered and stained with dried blood. Her body seemed to lean forward, slowly approaching, but it was her face that paralyzed the man. She had an expression of deep anger. Her face and neck showed a grotesque cut, and her voice, barely a whisper but laden with eternal rancor, resonated in the heavy air. She asked, her voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. Grossmuth stepped back, but there was no escape. The spectral figures advanced towards him, their voices filling the room like an incomprehensible murmur that seemed to resonate in his mind. Grossmuth screamed, his voice breaking as he fell to his knees. The figures pounced on him, and the darkness was filled with harrowing screams. The next day, the old Manton house stood in front with a deceptive serenity, almost defiant. Under the intense sunlight, its facade seemed less macabre, and the brambles and weeds surrounding it appeared to flourish with an unsettling vitality. This appearance was observed by three men approaching from the town of Marshall, each with a purpose and a background that clearly distinguished them. Sheriff Adams, to his right, walked King, the deputy sheriff, who was hiding something behind his calm exterior. Calm. The previous night, he had been at the house for reasons he did not share with the other two. And lastly, there was Mr. Brewer, brother of the late Mrs. Manton, who had requested possession of the property through the courts, invoking family rights over the abandoned farm. The door, surprisingly unlocked, opened with a creak that echoed like a scream in the afternoon's tranquility. What they found upon entering added another layer of mystery. A pile of men's clothes, but covered by a thick layer of dust, lay in the hallway like a macabre reminder of those who had been there before. Adams, intrigued but maintaining his composure, inspected the garments. Brewer took a step back, and his face was paler than before. King, on the other hand, showed no visible emotion, although his eyes remained fixed on the puzzling pile, as if searching for clues to that enigma. The commissioner, determined to continue, opened the door on the right side, inviting the others to follow him. The air in the room seemed to change immediately, heavy and laden, of a silence that was almost tangible. The room seemed seemingly completely empty at first, after first glance, but as their eyes slowly but surely adjusted, the men distinguished a figure crouched in what appeared to be an even darker corner. It was a man, motionless. His hands were in front of his face, not in a defensive gesture, but with fingers spread and twisted like claws. The man's face was a mask of pure panic, a vision that seemed torn from the depths of a nightmare. Beside him lay a knife, fallen from his hand, but there were no signs of struggle. However, in the dust, there were confused footprints near the door and along the wall, as if the man had desperately tried to escape before being cornered by something unseen. Adams inspected the rigid body, which seemed frozen at the exact moment of its panic. Brewer, horrified, recognized the corpse. Merciful God. "It's Manton," he shouted. King, who had remained in tense silence, tried to stay calm as he responded. "You're right. I knew Manton. At that time, he had a beard and long hair, but this is him." However, King did not say everything he knew. He didn't mention that he had recognized Manton before when he challenged him to a duel. He confessed that he and the others had played a cruel joke on him, knowing exactly who he was, and did not reveal that upon leaving the house the previous night, they had left Manton alone in the darkness, facing something that none of them dared to name. As King tried to understand the mystery of Manton's death, his gaze mechanically fell to the ground. There, in the dust, something struck him with a terror that left him paralyzed. 3. Parallel lines of footprints extended from the door to a meter from the body, light barefoot prints, belonging to small children, and a few scattered barefoot prints of a woman. But the most disturbing thing was that those footprints did not return. They all pointed in one direction, as if they had accompanied Manton to his final destination. Who also noticed the footprints pointed with both hands to one in particular. His voice, breaking into a shout, said, "Look at that! The middle toe is missing. It was Gertrude." Gertrude, Manton's deceased wife, seemed to have returned, not as a memory, but as a presence, still walking through the house, carrying with her the echo of her tragedy. In the end, the Manton house is not just a haunted place, but a symbol of how humanity's darkest acts can return to haunt those who commit them. It is indeed a reminder that true horror does not always come from the supernatural, but from the consequences of our own actions. The house remains quiet and silent, watchful, waiting for its next victim.